Hello everyone, it's Bavar from PTC here with the next episode in our Tevarin Wars mini-series, this time focusing on the course of the First War. After a less than stellar first contact, the Tevarin government declared war in 2541, with the war ending in 2546. This war wasn't due to any single reason, but rather a volatile and heady mix of a desperate need to expand due to overpopulation and the inability to terraform, as well as the importance, or cultural importance I should say, accorded to martial prowess and combat. As with most wars, these conflicts led to a wide variety of technological innovations and cross-pollination between the two warring species, with the UEE initially struggling against Tevarin's shield technology, and the Tevarin resorting to innovative tactics to overcome the UPE and subsequently the UEE's overall technological advantage. To begin with, the UPE at the time was very much caught off guard by the Tevarin's tenacity and sheer aggression. Their hit-and-run or guerrilla tactics over a standing fleet philosophy meant that the UPE was forever trying to catch smoke with their bare hands by the time the fleet proper had locked up. Taking keen advantage of Shrike and Talon coordinated strikes or ambushes, the Tevarins would routinely pick off transport craft or lone subcaps, etc., with the Prowler being particularly effective in that role, with her being able to sneak up on them, board them, and then methodically kill the crew. To illustrate the point, here's two quotes, one from Dennis Parfes, who served aboard the UPES Thulsa in 2544. You'd hear that scream, that whistle, but by then it was already too late. With the other, they'd be on top of you and unleash hell before you could scramble the fighters. Then they'd be long gone, disappeared without a trace, and you'd just be a sitting duck with your comms fried, waiting to hear that damn whistle again. From Lieutenant Weber Forbes, 12th Fighter Squadron, UPES Horizon 2544. It should be keenly noted that the Tevarin had turned the use of coordinated strikes into an art form, with groups of Talons and Shrikes attacking from multiple vectors at once. The Tevarin over the first few years of the war had become effectively wraiths in the black, making the UPE almost afraid of its own shadow. This forced the UPE forces to group together for protection, thereby creating additional weaknesses in the front lines, as well as forcing the usage of assets to protect resupply convoys. This gave the Tevarin forces a certain degree of free rein behind the UPE lines for raiding and sabotage forces or ambush forces, only making their hit-and-run ambushes and raids all the more effective. For the first few years of the war, momentum was on the Tevarin's side. Though the UPE had scored some victories, it was beginning to suffer setback after setback after setback, with their forces slowly being worn down over time, and they were beginning to lose systems. Whilst their overall technological superiority and superior numbers were holding the line to a point, their losses and casualties were sapping morale, and it was only a matter of time before there was a calamitous break in the front. Thankfully for the UPE, the Battle of Idris IV happened, which broke the back of the Tevarin forces and gave the UPE time and space it needed to catch its breath. The Tevarin mustered a surprise attack in 2542 and were able to seize the system. The invasion began with orbital bombardment, the craters from which can still be seen over 400 years later to give you an idea of the scale. Those that could fled, but some sought shelter in the mountains and went on to organize resistance groups with an aim to provide intelligence and assistance when the UPE finally struck back. By this point in the war, the Tevarin had gained ground in the Centauri system and had managed to push the UPE as far back as the Ferran system. Towards the end of August in 2544, High General Trevor Borland was getting impatient. He could foresee that if the lines stabilised, the conflict would descend into a mere war of attrition, which the UPE, with its greater investment in of materials and manpower into its cap ships could ill afford. In order to upset the current state of affairs, the skeleton of Operation Nemesis was sketched out. The intel boffins had identified a Tevarin shipyard on the surface of Idris 4, which was acting as the main repair and launching area for the system's fighters, as well as a hub for several unknown structures that were being built planet-wide. Operation Nemesis aimed to seize and occupy territory with the aim of acting as a forward operating position and as a foothold. As a part of this bold operation, the UPE's military R&D department had accelerated production of their brand new R-27HE hull shredder torpedoes, and had managed to get them ready in time. Naval forces assembled at the Ferran jump point, whilst Army and Marine units trained with as yet untested planetary invasion techniques. The battle was set to begin at 25:44 on the 30th of September 1345 Standard Earth time. The idea was for initial carriers, destroyers, corvettes and transports to surge forth following missile ships into the system under orders to ignore all Tevarin forces and space-based defences. Think a Thunder Run. This was to be done in an attempt to drag the fight into space above Idris 4, with key ships breaking off along the way to form a sort of defensive line between Idris 4 and the Ferran jump point. And once ground forces were deployed, the Navy was to stand and fight. Once the transports were in position, the Army and Marine forces were to invade, taking key control points with orders to hold until a steady stream of reinforcements could back them up and reconnect with the forces besieging the planet. Upon the operation kicking off, enemy contact was immediate. Specialized missile ships had made initial contact, engaging all targets until their stores were expended, and then withdrawing as the rest of the fleet arrived. After the Army and Marines deployed to the planet, the Navy took up a defensive stance above. The Battle of Idris 4 had begun in earnest, as the Tevarin fighters surged upwards. 3 transports were down during their descent, but fighting spilled out onto the ground as the rest of the transports made a successful planetfall. The 112th Infantry Battalion, under Colonel Tirokoshi, attacked the shipyard, designated as the Hill, along with 3 mechanized companies on loan from the 3rd Expeditionary Unit. After about 6 hours of guerrilla combat, the 112th and their support took the Hill. Some might say things were going a little too well, aside from the transports, that is, and that was very much the case. In response to the loss of the shipyard, the Tevarin sent a orbital bombardment from their fleet to their own shipyards below, a la Scorched Earth, and then to the UP's horror, the other shoe dropped. Those structures that were scattered around the planet that the Tevarin had been building turned out to be an experimental planetary defense system that was only now roaring to life. In the opening seconds, 2 carriers were pulverized, torn asunder by multiple volleys from the planet below. The surviving UPE ships scrambled to avoid the hellstorm of righteous fury from the planet below. On top of the mauling the ground forces were taking and the gutting of the defending naval forces, naturally, the hull shredder torpedoes decided to begin to fail en masse, with them either exploding in their tubes, which is always fantastically useful for the crew of the ships, or failing to arm when fired. Seemingly on cue with the bombardment and the chaos above, the Tevarin ground forces decided they'd get in on the action as well and attacked with renewed vigour. The 112th realised that they were going to be on their own very, very, very swiftly. They had taken horrific casualties with their mechanised escort at 50% strength. The soldiers were nowhere near as familiar with the installation as their enemies, and they were naturally having difficulty securing it, let alone defending it. The next day felt like 1,000 lifetimes. The naval vessels did their best to hold the line against wave after wave of its seemingly innumerable Tevarin fighters in the skies above, knowing that if they crumbled, all was lost, not only for them, but all those on the ground as well. The 1/12th suffered another devastating blow after a strafing run by a Tevarin fighter that dropped an antimatter bomb. This seemingly lucky hit decapitated the 1/12th. Unsurprisingly, the ground forces became scattered, demoralized, and the Tevarin sensed the blood in the water. What was left of the 3rd European Bravo Company fell to the Tevarin surge, with the remaining ground forces pulling back to their innermost positions. What little remained of the chain of command for the ground forces took another blow when Major Michael Calori of the 112th Battalion, Charlie Company, was trying to orchestrate an extraction plan and was taken out by a sniper. It was then his second-in-command, a young, ambitious officer, Captain Ivar Messer, assumed command. With extraction to orbit highly unlikely, let alone back to UPE space due to the planetary guns and the Tevarin forces, Messer began calling in danger-close bombing runs from whatever aircraft or spacecraft that were available, while he organised ambush points with the surviving soldiers. For the next few hours, the bombers dumped payload after payload onto the Tevarins. In an attempt to seize the initiative, Messer also organised a small recon force to destroy the planetary defences. As a part of this plan, they commandeered a downed Tevarin skiff and slipped past the lines. This team, led by a Sergeant Adam Core, had a stroke of luck, being able to discover the nexus of the planetary defence system as well as overtake it and assume control of it. This being accomplished, they turned the devastating weapons against the Tevarin fleet, thereby buying enough time for the UPE naval reinforcements to arrive. Due to this hammer and anvil with the UPE's capture of the guns, the Tevarin began to fall back. Eventually, due to the Tevarin's attempts to recapture the control center, Core and his team had to abandon it and detonate the control center. By the end of the battle, over 100 capital ships, several thousand fighters, and 70,000 lives had been lost. Messer and his forces still held the hill. The victory at Idris Four would galvanize the UPE and build on the momentum to push further into the Tevarin systems and subsequently help end the war. I hope you all enjoyed the second video in this lore mini-series, and let me know your favourite part below, or leave a like if you're feeling charitable. Should you want to know when the next portions are out, feel free to subscribe. This is Bavar from PTC, signing off.